Okay, so welcome to the second part of our close reading, looking at Ada Limon's poem, We Are Surprised, on page 42 in Bright Dead Things. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that you can see it along with me, though I do recommend following along with your own text. So one of the first things that I like to do, if you haven't watched the first video, please do so. I think that it will be helpful whenever you try to put all this together. We're trying to think about argumentation, but because we're going to wait on our argument for this book, for this particular poem, I should say, until we've done some of the work, we are going to start paying attention to the poem itself, looking at, I'm so sorry, specifically for both line and image. And I can't really highlight as well because I'm not that smart when it comes to this. Maybe I can. Now's not the time to learn. But what I want to do is think about how line, remember this is a line, now we take the moon, okay? This is a stanza, from now to brains, okay? And then this is a sentence, it looks like, from now all the way down to run. So this one takes up 3 two-line stanzas, and a stanza with 2 lines in it we call it a couplet. So these are just words that I want us to get more and more used to as we go forward. Another word I want to introduce you to right here is what we call a line break. I may have brought this up already. A line break is whenever the line ends and it starts a new line. And I'm going to show you how to write that in your own papers, how to show where a line break is. And this is what we would call a stanza break, where it's in between 2 stanzas and this word here. And we'll talk about line endings as well as we get more into the close reading section. But before I do any of that, one of the things I always like to do with a poem when I'm trying to understand it a little bit more deeply and spend a bit more time with it is I'd like to read it out loud and then see what it is that really stands out to me, to see if there's any sort of immediate impressions that I get when reading it that I think maybe later on I could turn into a critical observation. So sometimes these are even value judgments. I may say something like, as a number of us have with some of the other poems that we've been reading, notably the Whitman poem, this idea of it being confusing or hard to follow. And the question is, can we turn that into a critical statement, such as, the poem utilizes confusion, right? It's trying to enact confusion for a certain purpose. So really these first impressions can be really helpful for later on, which means why I have my pen, why I have my notebook here so that I can write them down. I don't want to forget them. That's always the rule. You'd be surprised how much you forget. So I'm going to read the poem and then sort of walk my way through it and see what stands out. So we are surprised. Now we take the moon into the middle of our brains, so we look like roadside stray cats with bright flashlight white eyes in our faces, but no real ideas of when or where to run. We linger on the field's green edge and say, someday, son, none of this will be yours. Miracles are all around. We're not so much homeless as we are home free, penny poor, but plenty lucky for love and leaves that keep breaking the fall. Here it is, the new way of living with the world inside of us so we cannot lose it and we cannot be lost. You and me are us and them and it and sky. It's hard to believe we didn't know that before. It's hard to believe we were so hollowed out, so drained, only so we could shine a little harder when the light finally came. Okay, so it has to me I've never really written about this poem. I've never specifically taught this poem. I don't think, maybe I have, but it doesn't really, I'm not really sure right now. So I'm working pretty cold from this. So some of this is just going to be a conversation, and hopefully it's helpful for you whenever you're going through it. So I get at this, there's kind of like an uplifting tone toward the end. I get this sense of it's complicated. It's not like actually uplifting. I wouldn't call it like a self-help poem, which sometimes when I'm trying to think of a thesis, I want sort of umbrella terms, like, is it a love poem? It's kind of like a love poem. I'm putting question marks next to that, but it does have this sense of like, things are going to be okay. So, is this, in that sense, is this like a poem of condolence, right? A poem trying to understand itself. So I don't really know, just kind of initial impressions. I may never return to any of these words, right? I may never see them again, but when I'm doing my study on the poetics of the poem and my close reading of that, if I find myself kind of dabbling into this language, it shows me there's a pattern forming. And that's what I'm trying to find, are patterns and variations, because that's where argumentation could come from. So what else do I notice in the poem just by looking at it and getting some sense? It's a pretty short poem, really. It's not incredibly long. If you think about Walt Whitman as being a long poem, this certainly doesn't seem like that. We have a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 stanzas with 2 lines each, so it's 22 lines long. You know, I don't know if that's short or long. It's not remarkably short, but it's certainly not very long. I think it's pretty traditionally, I don't know, an average size poem. I don't know. Looks very much like a poem to me. We have the couplets going. I see here also that the lines are relatively the same length across. There's some that are a little bit longer, but I wouldn't really say there's something that jumps out at me in terms of a line that looks predominantly different than the other ones, all pretty much the same. So structurally, I'm not really drawn to anything other than there's a sense of uniformity, like a sense of cohesion with all of these things. So I'm curious about what that means for the poem as a whole. Is this going to be a poem about conformity, a poem about their structure in it? And when I say structure with this, what I mean to say is that when you just look at the poem here, the way that it's been ordered, right, tells me that there has been an order applied to it. And so my goal is to see, well, what does ordering have to do with this particular poem? Does that have anything to do with things like upliftingness, love? I can't read my own handwriting there, but I'm sure it was important whenever I wrote it down. So what are the two connecting with? And if they are and if they're not. And then maybe if there's a disconnect, if this is a poem all about disorder, but the poet has very much ordered the poem in a certain way, then there's a tension between those two things, and I can write about that as well. Maybe this is all about a complicated love poem. I don't know yet, but I'm having some ideas, and I think that's really the point of this. Other things that stand out to me, the italics stand out to me as a kind of dialogue. So the poem is utilizing dialogue. I probably want to talk about that inside of a paper because it seems like, I mean, it's not necessarily right in the middle, but it's in that first third, toward the end of the first third into the second, right before this major shift into miracles. So it seems important. I'll probably want to mention the dialogue in here. It's just drawing our attention to that particular moment. The other thing is that when I was reading it, that really stood out to me is this "here it is" moment. That felt important. It changes the tone right there. I don't really know anything more specific than that at the moment. So my work in the next stage of this is going to try to figure out why am I drawn to that? That's my question right now, is what is this doing? Why does it feel so different than the rest of the poem? And what is it doing for me here? The second person, right? The use of the you here, right? That seems important to me. This feels very specific, and then moving them into these two other pronouns there to a more plural seems interesting to me. And then I thought it was interesting that the word believe becomes pretty powerful toward the end of the poem, and so does the word so. I kept hearing the word so in there. So I want to get a sense of, you know, again, I don't necessarily know what the word so is doing in the poem. I mean, I have a sense of it right now, but pardon me, she's repeating it so often, I think we're meant to have our attention drawn to it. So there's definitely going to be some time spent on all of that. So the next thing I want to really do is be able to come up with, generally speaking, a summary paragraph of the content of the poem. I'm going to start with that in the next video, is kind of showing an intro, summary, and then I'll start breaking it down a little bit. But before I do that, I want to mention the fact that because this is a poem from a text right now, from this book by, you'll hear my kid, he's cracking up. So Bright Dead Things here. It's part of the collection, and it's in the second section toward the end. And for me to be able to make sense of this, I need to know kind of what's going on in the second section. And there's a real predominant theme in the second section, and that is death. Death is very much, so in the first section, it's kind of about loneliness and displacement. Our speaker has gone from New York to Kentucky, has entered into a relationship that seems positive and healthy, but also it's just complicated because it's difficult to put yourself into a new position with this idea of falling in love and moving in with somebody. And then so in the second section, though, we're learning a little bit more about her family. The parents are divorced. The biological parents are divorced. She has both the speaker has both a stepfather and a stepmother, and the stepmother has died in this. And there's a lot of poems of grief in here, very specific about the cancer and how much the speaker misses that, and misses not the cancer, but misses the presence of her stepmother, though the relationship between the two is often complicated throughout. She's not necessarily presented as an angelic character, a perfect figure of support. But in fact, they have a somewhat complicated relationship, or they did have a complicated relationship, and there's, of course, some regret in this poem as well, and some elements of loss inside of here. So this is a poem built inside of a section sort of around death and grief and loss. And we have in this moment a poem about a you that's in here, and this sense of where do they belong, and what does it mean to belong. And there's a pretty clear, so what I'm going to write down right now is poem of belonging with a question mark. Like that can be a kind of poem. It's not like a fancy poem phrase or whatever, like, you know, like an ubi sunt or a sonnet. Like it's not that, but it's like, is this a poem that's trying to show me how belonging matters and how connecting with others matters? And maybe that's something really interesting inside of the book. Because the goal here that I'm trying to do, if you'll notice, is I have this whole book here, right? And then it's split up into 4 sections. So I've picked one section, and then within that section, I've got, my hands are getting in the way. I have picked one poem, and then within a poem, I'm going to get it down to even smaller and smaller components. I'll probably end up talking about punctuation at some point. And the hope is that when I focus here, and I use this as sort of like the precipitate where my attention goes, I can extrapolate that out more to where I'm talking about the book as a whole. That's what I want to be able to do inside of any paper. I want to be that belongs to a larger text. Is I want to be able to teach you this, but to do that, I need you to look here, right? Not literally like here, but you know, the ends where my fingers and the periods are. I don't know. Anyway, so that's this video for part 1 or part 2. Really, we're kind of looking at the poem in its general sense. I'll start drafting a rough draft for an essay on it, and then I'll share that and walk you through at least 2 different versions of that, so that you have a sense of what I think could be helpful with this. So more to come.